And people don't want to talk about the distribution of wealth in this country because then they'll, oh, that's socialist. Blah, blah, blah. But I mean, everybody should have at least um, a quality of life that provides for basic human needs such as food and shelter and medical care, and that when you're dealing with that kind of disparity, it can't help but impact everything else that happens for people. Race is another one of those areas where it's the response to the race that is the problem. Mm-hmm. That people have fears about people who look different from them. They hold values about people who they define. People have very closed definitions of beauty and kindness and value there, and so it's easy to just cluster people that you don't understand or who aren't like you, and to say, oh well, they're not. We always say, it's like when someone buys a car, and if they buy a different car, like if somebody has a Honda and somebody else buys a Toyota, walking around, who maybe happens to be black or brown, or who happens to have family happens to have low financial means, but inside that child's brain could be the creative genius that could cure cancer, that could cure hunger. We don't know what we are throwing away generation after generation after generation because we don't want people to have the opportunity to fully grow and flourish. And as a species, we kind of will be in trouble. I mean, we're doing enough negative things to the planet already, but we don't know where the solutions are. We don't know that a person has to look a certain way to be able to solve a problem. So as a species, if for no other reason, aside from just, I mean, my own moral conscience says we need to just not do this because it's not the humane way to treat people. Mm-hmm. But if for selfish reasons, if people in power and privilege need to have a reason, they could be shortcutting themselves. The cure for some horrible disease could be sitting down on Martin Luther King Boulevard somewhere in the city, just killing time because they got pushed out of school as opposed to being there and being able to come up with creative problems and problem-solving techniques.
So in a lot of my research, it talked about how, at least in this country, that it's not really about explicit racism.
Well, I think, in this country now, unfortunately, explicit and implicit are getting pretty explicit stuff is getting real bold. Since 2016 election, mm-hmm. we've been having people step up real bold with mm-hmm. that explicit, which is, very ugly and hurtful. But implicit bias is one of those things when we have to look at anything that we do in the classroom and think, okay, who is going to have ready access to be successful? Are there some kids that are going to be more likely to be successful with this task? And if so, why? And if so, what are ways that I can make sure other kids can also have access to be successful? So, for example, one of the things that I talk with my students about is this notion of how certain cultures respond to questions. So there's a man named Asa Hilliard who did this research a long time ago, where he talked about how interdependent cultures where people are more important than supporting each other is more important than competing with each other. So in interdependent cultures, people tend to want to connect with other people. They want to talk with them, hang out with them.
Where I live, and then I go straight all the way down Oliver, which leads to a dead end. Then you go up a hill. Don't know what the hill's called. And then you take a right onto Farnsworth, and then you take a left on the highway. Pretty sure it's 130, and then you go down for 2 minutes till you pass a Chickies and Pete's, and there's a little split off, and you veer to the right, and then you go down, and then the school's on the left.
Okay, good. All right. So that is a good example of, and I kind of pushed you to do that. You said with streets and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So people who are Hilliard talks about people who are more linear thinkers. And so when I would ask you that question, you would start by, well, you come from my house, which is this street, and I go to this street, and then I do this, and I make a right, and I make a left, and I go up a hill. And he says that's a very linear response, which is fine. He said, but then you might ask people who are from an interdependent culture the same question, and so ask me how I get here from my house.
How do you get here from your house?
From my house. Well, like back, it seems like it's a little over 20 years now, when my family decided to move here. Oh my goodness, it was such a big deal about where we were going to live compared to the college, because we wanted our son to go to a good high school, but what neighborhood should we live in? And so we went around and around, and eventually, like, we looked at houses in Princeton. So I start this whole thing before, I still haven't told you what you've asked me, right? And so eventually I would tell you that fortunately, I live very close to campus. I leave my house. I go to Denau Road. I live on Chicory Lane. I'd go to Chicory Lane, hit Denau Road, Federal City, Ewingville Road, Pennington Road to the campus. But what Hilliard says is that very often people who come from interdependent cultures come from a storytelling culture. So for me to even tell you how to get here from my house, I gotta tell you a story. Girl, when we got ready to move here, it was such a struggle. We couldn't decide where to live. Now, it's not what you asked me. You asked me, how do you get from your house to here? But I start telling you a story. In schools, if a kid started responding like that, usually teachers would go, Brenda, I didn't ask you what happened 20 years ago. I don't care about your family moving here. I didn't ask you that. I asked you to give me. I wanted that linear response. I live on Chicory. I go to Denau. I make a left turn on Denau. That's what I wanted. And so, but what happens when you do that? So the teacher might cut me off and go to somebody else. Okay, you tell me. Then I sit there and I'm thinking, I was going to tell you. You didn't really want to hear it. And the teacher's thinking, I didn't want to hear all this story, right? But what Hilliard tries to help us understand is that there's value in both ways of communicating. That people who tell stories typically come from cultures where people are more important and where understanding the whole context is really important. It's not just, when you ask me about my home, that's more than just an address. That's where I live. Oh, well, let me tell you how I ended up living there. So it has this deeper connection for me. And what Hilliard warns us about is that very often in schools, we don't give kids time to connect. And kids who come from cultures where that connection is important, it limits their ability to connect to what you're asking them to do. So what might seem like a simple map exercise or a simple direction exercise can have more meaning if I can connect it. So especially like if kids were doing like north, south, east, west, and you ask them to do that. Oh, I travel west on this street and then east. To make it have more meaning, kids sometimes need to have that personal story. On the other hand, kids also need to learn how to shorten it. Okay, so, yeah, Brenda, I really want to hear that, but we got to go to lunch in a little bit. So can you just kind of jump to the part where you tell me directly how to get, and then on the way to lunch, tell me about that again. I want to hear more about how your family made the decision when you moved here. The other side of it, too, is that sometimes we have kids that we perpetuate just this linear, just give me the facts, just very objective thinking, and we don't help them think, but it's not just that. They're people. They're humans. And so we're minimizing their opportunity to connect as people, and we're not pushing them to do it. If you give me that linear response, fine, let's move on. And I'm not asking you to connect to people. And so one of the things that we talk about in schools is that if we can just think about what are the opportunities that kids might have to learn to grow, to demonstrate what they've learned in different ways. So sometimes I'm going to ask you to just give me that very linear right, left, north, south, east, west. And then other times I'm going to say, tell me a time when you had to make a decision about where you were going to live and how would you make that decision? Or and then in the process of that, like give it some meaning. Like when is the time you had to use directions? Oh, I was going over this friend's house and I didn't know how to get there. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, tell me about that. It was like I got invited to this party, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's like we need to give kids as many opportunities to have voice and to make connections. And that's one of the things that schools, because of a lot of reasons, are not doing. And kids who are already privileged see themselves and their future options in the way things work now. It's fine. I can do this and I can have minimal whatever and I'll be fine. But other kids who already are feeling like they're not as valuable anyway, they don't have the opportunity. And so one of the things we need to think about is how do we make schools places where everybody feels they belong and that they're valued and that they have something to say and that they not only have the voice to say it, but that they should be heard. And that's a lot. I mean, that's a lot to ask, but schools don't do that. Mm-hmm. The achievement gap, which is also often now discussed as the opportunity gap, is the disparity between people's opportunity to be successful. It's a disparity that is created not by necessarily the person themselves, but by either institutional or other factors that give advantage to some people and privilege to some people and disadvantage other people. And so when people don't have the same access, then the results on the other end are usually somehow deficient on those people who have been hindered in their access.
So I know you said that it's sometimes called the opportunity gap, and I was reading a couple articles where they did call it that, and a big article about why it should be called that, and in your opinion, what should we be calling it?
In my opinion, I think opportunity gap is really more of an issue because the achievement gap does speak to what people are able to accomplish. But once it's entitled achievement gap, it almost puts the responsibility on the person that for some reason you did not achieve what you should, and it implies that it sits with the person who did not achieve it. Opportunity gap means that there's something in place that is limiting access, limiting opportunities, which is usually the major factor in what we see as achievement disparity. Is usually not just because of an individual person maybe not working hard enough or not being motivated strongly. It's usually complicated by all kinds of situational factors that are beyond their control or that have a significant impact on their ability to even fully take advantage of what opportunities are open to them.
So my next question is, what can schools and families do to lessen the impact or help that close the achievement gap or opportunity gap?
What kinds of things can they do? I think one of the things is that we have to carefully examine systems that are in place that privilege certain groups over other groups. And we have to have honest conversations that's just the reality in a nation that has been born out of disparity. That the reality of our nation's history has always been that certain groups have received priority over other groups, and not only received priority over other groups, but purposefully limited opportunities to certain groups. And that we have to understand that while people like to say, well, my parents weren't here as colonizers who, enslaved the indigenous people. That wasn't me. I mean, that might have been a long time ago, but that's over with now. the vestiges of that action is still with us.
Mm-hmm.
The attitudes that people have, the access that people have. When we think about, for example, the indigenous people, to have the best land taken away, to have the access to schools that were appropriate to their culture to help sustain identities. When you strip identities from people and tell them that it's not valued, it has a long-term effect. And the same thing with people of African descent in this country, to come as an enslaved people who were devalued in every way, shape, or form, as opposed to being valued for the resources and wealth that they had lived with before being taken as slaves. So I think one of the things is we have to have honest conversations that our country is still dealing with the vestiges of a history that's not very pretty. Mm-hmm. And to pretend that we are not still living in the I don't want to say the halo of it, because halo implies something positive, but we're still living in the shadow of those actions. And so the people who represent those groups who have been historically devalued and intentionally devalued and disengaged and disenfranchised, then we can't fix it. And then once we realize that, okay, so we've done stuff that has created this, how do we deconstruct it so that we can improve it if we really want to improve it? But there are times when I'm not so sure the nation really wants to improve it. Because if I now give equal access, fair access to everybody, then the competition for those slots that the people in power have always held, the competition becomes greater. And people don't want to see those positions of privilege very often. I mean, some people are willing to acknowledge it, but very few who really hold power and privilege, they kind of like it that way. And they're like, oh, I didn't cause it, but oh well, yeah. I kind of like it.
So my next